The scrape of the trowel against stone echoed through the chamber like a death knell each stroke of mortar sealed. Her fate a little more completely. Sister Agnes pressed her palms against the growing wall, her breath coming in desperate gasps as the opening grew smaller and smaller. "Please," she whispered, her voice already muffled by the thick stones, "I beg you, show mercy." But the masons worked in grim silence. Their faces set like granite. The abbeys stood watching her, expression cold as winter frost. There would be no mercy here, not for one who had broken the most sacred of vows. The final stone scraped into place with a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The try's last stroke sealed the mortar. The only light now came from a single small opening near the top of the wall, barely large enough for a cup of water to pass through. Sister Agnes was alone now in her tomb of stone, surrounded by walls that would be both her prison and her grave. Her crime, a vow broken, her sentence to become a living ghost. Entombed within these very walls, the darkness pressed against her like a living thing, and her muffled sobs echoed in the tiny space that would be her world until death finally claimed her. How could this happen? What vows were broken? What ancient laws decreed such a fate? How did a society reach a point where walling up a nun alive was considered divine justice? To understand this horror, we must journey back through the darkest chapters of human punishment and religious extremism in the sacred grove of Vesta. A young woman raised her trembling hand and spoke words that would bind her soul. "I swear by the sacred flame to remain pure in body and spirit for 30 years. But if that sacred promise was broken even against her, well, the law demanded a death that shed no blood. The ancient world took vows seriously, deadly seriously, when a Roman girl of noble birth was chosen to become a Vestal virgin. She wasn't just taking on a religious role, she was entering into a contract with the gods themselves. One that carried the most extreme penalties imaginable. There were 6 women selected as children, tasked with keeping Rome's sacred flame burning for 30 years. Their purity wasn't just personal, it was tied directly to the survival of the empire itself. Romans believed that if the vessels remained chaste, Rome would stand forever. But if one faltered, if one gave in to human desire, the very foundations of civilization would crumble. The pressure was unimaginable. These women lived under constant scrutiny, their every movement watched, their every interaction analyzed for signs of impropriety. But here's where it gets truly chilling: the punishment for breaking their vow wasn't just death. Death would have been merciful. Roman law forbade the spilling of a Vestal's blood even in execution, so the authorities devised something far more horrifying. They called it the campus sceleratus, the evil field. It was a place of ultimate terror where the sacred and the profane collided in the most brutal way possible. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, the process was as ritualistic as it was cruel. The Pontifex Maximus would perform the ceremony with cold precision. The condemned woman would be stripped of her sacred badges, scourged publicly, then dressed like a corpse and carried through the streets in a funeral litter. Her own family would weep as they followed, knowing they were witnessing her final journey among the living. But the horror was just beginning. At the campus sceleratus, workers had prepared a chamber deep underground, a space barely large enough for a person to stand or lie down. The condemned vessel would be lowered into this earthen tomb along with a lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a small amount of milk. Then the entrance would be sealed forever. The authorities called this mercy. They weren't technically killing her, they were simply removing her from the world and letting the gods decide her fate. The lamp would eventually burn out, the food would run out, and in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth, the woman who had once tended Rome's sacred flame would face a slow, agonizing death by starvation and dehydration. But get this: the accusations didn't even need to be true. The mere suspicion of impropriety was often enough. A glance held too long, a conversation deemed inappropriate, even being the victim of assault, all could be twisted into evidence of a broken vow. The system cared nothing for truth or justice, only for maintaining the illusion of purity at any cost. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical. These women spent their final days knowing that their own society, their own religious leaders, the very people they had served faithfully, had condemned them to the most horrific death imaginable. The betrayal was complete, absolute, and final. Some historians believe the practice served a darker purpose beyond religious conviction. It was a tool of political control when Rome needed a scapegoat for military defeats or natural disasters, a convenient Accusation against a Vestal virgin provided the perfect solution. The gods were angry because of her impurity. Her punishment would restore divine favor. The records speak of Vestals who maintained their innocence even as the earth was shoveled over their living tombs. Their final words were often prayers, not confessions. They died still claiming their purity, still calling on the very gods who had supposedly abandoned them. And here's the most chilling part: this wasn't the action of a barbaric primitive society. This was Rome at its height, the civilization that gave us law, literature, engineering. Marvels that still stand today. Yet they buried women alive for the crime of being human. The practice continued for centuries, a testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty when religion and power combine in the darkest possible ways. Each underground chamber became a monument to our ability to transform faith into fanaticism, piety into persecution for their crime against the gods. They would be delivered to a silent subterranean world where their only companion was the slow creep of starvation and the crushing weight of society's ultimate betrayal. Vade in pace. The abbé's voice rang with false solemnity as she pronounced the Latin words, "Go in peace." Words that sounded like a blessing, but for a nun who had broken her sacred vows they were a death sentence wrapped in religious mockery. Medieval Europe had learned well from Rome's example, but they refined the art of living burial into something even more psychologically devastating. Where Romans buried their Vestals in earthen chambers, Christian authorities preferred something more architectural. They walled people up. The practice became so common in the 13th and 14th centuries that it earned its own horrifying terminology. Vade in pace, go in peace became the ecclesiastical euphemism for immune, the ultimate punishment for those who had betrayed their sacred vows. The irony was deliberate and cruel. Peace through prolonged agony. Here's where it gets even more twisted. Unlike the Roman method, which at least promised a relatively quick death by starvation, the medieval church perfected a system of sustained torment. They would wall up the condemned person but leave a small opening just large enough to pass through a cup of water and a morsel of bread. The victim wouldn't die quickly. They would linger for weeks, months, sometimes even years. The Swedish holy man's case perfectly illustrates this calculated cruelty. Accused of some unnamed transgression against his vows, he was sealed into a stone chamber with nothing but a tiny hole for sustenance. But here's the psychological master stroke: his captives fed him just enough to keep him alive, prolonging his suffering indefinitely. They wanted him to have plenty of time to contemplate his sins, to truly understand the weight of his transgression. For nuns, the punishment carried an additional layer of humiliation. These women had surrendered their lives to God, had given up family, marriage, children, everything that society told them gave a woman worth. Their identity was completely bound up in their religious vocation. To be accused of breaking their vows didn't just threaten their lives, it erased their very sense of self. The process began with investigation, but the standards of evidence would horrify any modern court. Whispered accusations from jealous sisters, unexplained pregnancies, even just appearing too friendly with a male visitor could trigger the process. The accused nun would be stripped of her habit, her head shaved, her religious name revoked. She would be dressed in the rough cloth of a penitent and made to confess her sins publicly. But here's the thing that makes your blood run cold: confession didn't save them. In the twisted logic of medieval justice, breaking a sacred vow was so heinous that even genuine repentance couldn't erase the stain. The only way to purify the sin was through ultimate sacrifice. The actual immurement followed a grim ritual. The condemned nun would be led to a specially prepared chamber, often built into the walls of the convent itself. Her sisters would chant funeral hymns as she was sealed inside. The message was clear: she was dead to them, dead to God, dead to the world. Only her body remained, and that was left to suffer as a warning to others. Some accounts describe nuns spending their final hours before immunement in desperate prayer, still believing that divine intervention might save them. Others fell into complete despair, their faith shattered by the realization that the institution they had devoted their lives to was now orchestrating their destruction. The small opening that provided minimal sustenance became a window into madness. Guards or other nuns would periodically check on the immured woman, listening for sounds of life. Some victims spent their final weeks pleading for mercy that would never come. Others retreated into silence, their minds broken by the impossible situation. The cruelest cases involved women who survived for extended periods. There are records of immured nuns Being fed for over a year, their voices gradually growing weaker as they called out from behind their stone walls. The sound must have haunted the other sisters, a constant reminder of what awaited anyone who stepped outside the rigid boundaries of acceptable behavior. But the authorities had convinced themselves this was mercy. They weren't executing these women, they were giving them the ultimate opportunity for spiritual reflection and repentance. The fact that this opportunity came wrapped in physical and psychological torture was simply the price of purification. The phrase "vade in pace" became a whispered threat throughout medieval convents. Sisters who showed any sign of independence, any hint of human desire, would be reminded of those two simple words, and the horror they represented sealed away from the world their peace was an eternity of darkness, hunger, and the fading echoes of their own condemned prayers, punctuated only by the periodic arrival of sustenance that prolonged their agony. The hammer struck metal with a sound like thunder, each blow driving another nail into the wooden coffin, but this coffin held no corpse inside. A living woman struggled against her bonds, her muffled cries barely audible through the thick wood. Imagine a coffin not for the dead but for the living, a space so small you can neither sit upright nor lie down, your world reduced to an ironbound box. The photograph from 1922 shows us the Mongolian woman captured in the most horrifying moment imaginable, trapped inside a wooden box barely large enough for her body. Her crime remains unknown to history, but her punishment speaks volumes about humanity's capacity for cruelty. The box was her world now, a space where every breath was a struggle and every movement brought agony. But get this, that woman was experiencing luxury compared to what other cultures devised. The Mongolian prisoners photographed in 1914 faced something even more diabolical. Their captives forced them into heavy iron-bound coffins that allowed them neither to sit upright nor to lie down fully. Picture trying to exist in a space that denies your body any position of comfort, where every moment brings physical pain. These prisoners were kept alive through a small hole cut in the top of their prison, just large enough for meager rations to be passed through. The authorities fed them enough to prevent immediate death, but never enough to restore strength. The psychological impact was devastating. Hope became the cruelest torture of all, as each meal meant another day of agony rather than blessed release. The reports describe men who lost their minds within weeks. Their humanity slowly stripped away by the impossible conditions. Some begged for death, others retreated into Catholic states, their minds protecting them by shutting down completely, but their bodies continued to suffer, trapped in iron prisons that turned every natural function into an ordeal. In Morocco, the case of Mezoui, the Marrakesh arch-killer, demonstrates how immune could be combined with other tortures for maximum suffering. After being brutally whipped, he was walled up alive in a narrow space. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Witnesses reported hearing his screams for 2 full days, 2 days of uninterrupted agony, his voice growing weaker and more desperate until finally mercifully silenced. The acoustic horror of these punishments cannot be overstated. Imagine living near such a place, hearing the gradual transformation from defiant shouts to desperate pleas to inhuman moans to final terrible silence. The sound alone would haunt anyone within earshot for the rest of their lives. Jean-Baptiste Taver's account from Persia reveals perhaps the most psychologically devastating variant of all. The condemned person would be immune up to the neck, their head left exposed to the elements. This wasn't about quick death, this was about prolonged public humiliation and suffering. The victim would endure scorching sun, freezing nights, and the constant terror of approaching birds that might steal sight or flesh. But the true horror lay in the social aspect. Passers-by could see the victim's face, could watch the slow progression from defiance to despair to madness. Some victims tried to maintain conversation, desperately clinging to human contact. Others retreated into themselves, their eyes growing vacant as their minds fled from an unbearable reality. The birds presented a constant threat, and psychological torture. Ravens and crows, drawn by the scent of helplessness, would perch nearby waiting. The victim could see them approaching, could anticipate their interest in exposed flesh, but remained completely powerless to defend themselves. The fear of having eyes pecked out became an additional layer of torment. Weather became another instrument of torture. Rain would be simultaneously blessing and curse, providing desperately needed water while soaking the victim's hair and face. Sun would burn exposed skin. Raw winter brought the agony of frostbite to extremities that couldn't be protected or warmed. The most disturbing aspect was the calculated nature of these punishments. They weren't the result of sudden rage or passion, they were carefully planned, methodically executed, and deliberately sustained. Authorities had to build the structures, assign guards, organize feeding schedules. The bureaucracy of cruelty required dozens of people to participate, each playing their small role in an orchestrated nightmare. Some victims lasted for weeks in these conditions, their resilience becoming a spectacle that drew crowds. People would come to stare, to judge, to feel superior to the condemned. The public nature of the suffering was part of the punishment, not just physical death but complete social annihilation. Each breath a struggle, each day an eternity, proving that sometimes the most cruel punishments are those that deny even the release of death, forcing the victim to endure in a liminal space between life and mercy in a world bound by rigid vows. What happened when human desire clashed with divine law? For some the temptation was a whisper that grew louder with each passing day, but the Church's answer was a roar of condemnation that echoed through stone corridors and lived in the nightmares of every religious person who dared to feel human. The pressure on those who took sacred vows was unimaginable by modern standards. Nuns entered the convent as young as 12 years old, surrendering not just their present lives but their entire futures to God. They promised to remain chaste not just in body but in thought, to suppress every natural human impulse that might conflict with their spiritual duties. But here's the thing about human nature: it refuses to be completely suppressed. The same hearts that beat with devotion to God also beat with the fundamental desires that make us human: love, companionship, physical intimacy. These weren't just temptations to medieval religious authorities, they were existential threats to the entire system of religious control. The convent walls that were meant to protect spiritual purity also created a pressure cooker of repressed emotion and natural human need. Sisters lived in close quarters for decades, sharing every aspect of their lives except the most basic human connections. Some formed intense emotional bonds that spiritual authorities viewed with deep suspicion. Others developed relationships with priests, confessors, or male visitors that crossed the invisible lines of acceptable interaction. The most tragic cases involved women who had been forced into religious life by families seeking to avoid dowry payments or remove inconvenient daughters from inheritance disputes. These women had never chosen their vows freely, yet they faced the same deadly consequences for breaking promises they had been coerced into making. When accusations arose, the investigation process was designed to find guilt rather than truth. A nun seen speaking privately with a male visitor might be questioned for hours about the exact words exchanged. Physical evidence of pregnancy was damning, but even circumstantial evidence could be fatal. A love letter, a gift received, even just unusual emotional attachment to another person could trigger the horrifying machinery of ecclesiastical justice. The psychological torture began long before any physical punishment. Accused nuns would be isolated from their sisters, forbidden to participate in religious services, stripped of their duties and identity. They would spend weeks or months in solitary confinement, knowing that each day might bring news of their final sentence. The uncertainty was as devastating as the eventual punishment. Some authorities believed that intense spiritual pressure would force confessions. They would subject accused nuns to extended periods of prayer, fasting, and spiritual examination, designed to break down psychological defenses. Sleep deprivation combined with constant religious instruction about sin and redemption created a mental state where women might confess to crimes they hadn't committed simply to end the psychological assault. The standards for proof were impossibly subjective. A nun's demeanor during questioning could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Too emotional meant she was confessing through her tears. Too calm meant she was hiding her sin through practiced deception. There was literally no way to respond that couldn't be twisted into confirmation of guilt by authorities determined to find it. But here's what makes these cases particularly heartbreaking: many of the accused women maintained their innocence even when faced with immunity. They would go to their living graves still protesting that they had been faithful to their vows, still believing that God would vindicate them, still hoping that truth would somehow prevail over institutional cruelty. The system created its own momentum of paranoia and accusation. Once authorities had aimed one nun for breaking her vows, other sisters lived in constant terror that they might be next. Every interaction was scrutinized, every emotion suppressed, every natural human response filtered through the lens of potential spiritual transgression. Some nuns developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, constantly questioning their own thoughts and motivations. They would confess to imaginary sins, report themselves for having normal human feelings, desperately trying to stay ahead of any possible accusation. The psychological damage was profound and irreversible. The irony was devastating. Institutions supposedly dedicated to love, mercy, and forgiveness became engines of suspicion, betrayal, and ultimately murder. The same vows meant to bring these women closer to God became the instruments of their destruction, twisted into weapons by authorities more concerned with control than with genuine spiritual guidance. The message was clear and terrifying: human nature itself was the enemy, and any sign of normal human emotion or desire would be met with the most extreme punishment imaginable, for in their eyes a moment of perceived weakness wasn't just a personal failing, it was a stain on the sacred, demanding a purification by ordeal that would serve as eternal warning to anyone who dared to remain human. The bell tolled with funeral solemnity as the ecclesiastical court prepared to render its verdict. The accusation was made, the judgment swift and terrible for a Vestal Virgin. Her path to a living tomb was a horrifying public spectacle, each ritual step designed to strip away not just life but dignity, identity, and hope itself. The Roman process was as precise as it was cruel. When a Vestal Virgin stood accused of breaking her sacred vow, the Pontifex Maximus himself would preside over her condemnation. The ceremony began with the stripping away of her sacred badges, the ribbons, the brooches, the symbols that had marked her as one of Rome's most holy women. Each item removed was another piece of her identity torn away. The scourging came next, administered publicly to demonstrate that her sacred status could no longer protect her. The whip fell again and again as crowds gathered to witness the fall of one who had once been above their station. The physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological devastation of being transformed from revered priestess to condemned criminal in a matter of hours. But here's where the ritual became truly diabolical. They dressed her like a corpse, the clothes of the dead, the binding cloth, the funeral ornaments, all served to emphasize that she was no longer among the living. Even though her heart still beat and her lungs still drew breath, she was being prepared for burial while still alive, forced to participate in her own funeral rites. The procession through Rome was designed to maximize both public spectacle and personal humiliation. Carried in a funeral litter as if already dead, she could hear the weeping of her family members who followed behind. They mourned her as if she had already died, because in the eyes of the law and society she had her crime had erased her from the world of the living. For a medieval nun facing similar charges, the process followed an equally devastating pattern. The ecclesiastical trial would be conducted in Latin, often preventing the accused from fully understanding the proceedings against her. Witnesses would testify to suspicious behavior, inappropriate conversations, or moral failings that might not even constitute actual violations of vows. The formal stripping of religious status was particularly cruel for nuns whose entire identity was bound up in their religious vocation. They would be forced to remove their habits, surrender their religious names, and renounce the vows that had given their lives meaning. Some descriptions tell of women collapsing completely during this process, their psychological foundations shattered by the systematic destruction of everything they had believed themselves to be. The public or semi-public nature of these proceedings served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the Church's power to those who witnessed it, warned others about the consequences of transgression, and completely isolated the condemned woman from any possible source of support or sympathy. Family members who tried to intervene might find themselves accused of interfering with divine justice. The pronouncement of sentence was often accompanied by elaborate theological justification. Authorities would explain at length how the punishment served God's will, how it would purify the Church, how it would protect other religious persons from contamination by the condemned woman's sin. The victim was forced to listen to detailed explanations of why her upcoming torture and death were not just necessary but holy. Between sentence and execution, the condemned woman would typically be held in solitary confinement, often in the very chamber where she would eventually be immune. This served to break down any remaining psychological resistance while allowing time for the construction of her tomb. She would hear the sounds of Workers preparing the site of her death, the scraping of mortar, the placement of stones, the testing of the small opening through which her meager rations would be passed. Some accounts describe condemned women using this time to write final letters to family members, prayers or protestations of innocence. Others retreated into complete silence, their minds protecting them by shutting down entirely. The guards would watch for signs of attempted suicide, as authorities wanted to control every aspect of the dying process. The final preparation involved the last meal, often a symbolic portion of bread and water that echoed the meager rations she would receive in her tomb. Some condemned women refused this food, seeing it as participation in their own murder. Others ate desperately, knowing it might be their last moment of physical comfort. The moment of final transport to the immurement site was carefully choreographed to emphasize the irreversible nature of what was happening. No last-minute reprieves, no possibility of appeal, no hope of divine intervention, just the inexorable movement toward a death that would come slowly and in complete isolation. And as the solemn procession reached the place of her entombment, she knew every ritualistic step brought her closer to being erased from the world of the living, forgotten by all except those who would hear her fading cries. The sound of careful brushing filled the ancient corridor as archaeologists worked to uncover what lay hidden behind the medieval wall. A forgotten abbey in England, workers renovating an ancient church, and suddenly a discovery that chills the blood. Human remains found where no grave should be, telling stories of unimaginable suffering that time had tried to erase. The skeleton found at Thornton Abbey painted a particularly haunting picture of interrupted life. There he sat, the nameless abbot, surrounded by the remnants of his final moments, a book still open beside him, a wooden table where he had perhaps tried to continue his studies, a candlestick that had long since burned out. His positioning suggested he had been immured while still alive, sealed into his chamber with the basic necessities of monastic life, but no hope of escape. But here's what makes this discovery so disturbing: the evidence suggests he wasn't prepared for death. His personal effects were arranged as if he expected to continue his daily routine. The book was positioned for reading, not as a final ritual object. This wasn't a voluntary retreat or spiritual reflection. This was abandonment, pure and simple. Across Europe, similar discoveries continue to emerge with alarming regularity. Adult skeletons found sealed within the foundations of ancient bridges tell stories of superstitious construction practices that treated human lives as expendable building materials. These weren't accidents or natural deaths. The positioning and circumstances clearly indicate deliberate immurement. The discovery of child skeletons embedded in church walls presents perhaps the most horrifying evidence of how widespread and casual these practices had become. Children, innocent of any possible crime or transgression, were apparently sacrificed to ensure structural integrity based on nothing more than supernatural belief. The Turkish soldiers who buried children alive in the foundations of Araga were following traditions that stretched back centuries across multiple cultures. Hume Griffith's 1903 account from Persia provides one of the most chilling pieces of evidence for how recently these practices continued. Standing beside ancient brick pillars, he reported hearing distinct groaning sounds from within the structures. The implication was horrifying: people might still be alive inside walls that had stood for decades, sustained by minimal provisions passed through tiny openings. The acoustic evidence is particularly disturbing because it suggests a level of systematic maintenance that goes beyond simple execution. Someone was responsible for feeding these hidden prisoners, for ensuring they remained alive long enough to suffer appropriately. The groans Griffith heard represented not just individual agony but an entire infrastructure of sustained cruelty. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed the true scope of immune practices across cultures and centuries. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive methods have identified suspicious voids within ancient structures, many of which contain human remains. When investigated, the implications are staggering. How many buildings throughout Europe and Asia contain similar hidden chambers with their silent occupants? The physical evidence often contradicts official historical records. While church documents might mention a nun or monk who disappeared or went into solitary retreat, archaeological evidence reveals the brutal reality: they were walled up alive and left to die slowly. The bureaucratic language of religious institutions provided convenient cover for systematic murder. Some discoveries Include personal effects that tell heartbreaking stories of final moments. Jewelry hidden within clothing suggests women who tried to preserve some small token of their former lives. Religious medals found clutched in skeletal hands indicate people who maintained faith even as their religious institutions orchestrated their destruction. These tiny artifacts humanize what could otherwise become merely historical statistics. The preservation of organic materials in some immune sites has provided detailed information about the final days of victims. Analysis of fingernail scrapings from chamber walls shows evidence of desperate attempts to claw through solid stone. Hair samples reveal extreme malnutrition consistent with prolonged starvation. Fabric remnants tell stories of gradual decay that paralleled the slow dying of their wearers. But perhaps the most disturbing discoveries are those that suggest immunement was used as a form of entertainment or display. Some chambers were constructed with viewing slots that would have allowed observers to watch the gradual deterioration of the victims. This transforms individual cruelty into social spectacle, implicating entire communities in the prolonged torture of helpless people. The regularity of new discovery suggests that immunement was far more common than historical records indicate. Every renovation of an ancient building, every archaeological survey of medieval sites risks uncovering new evidence of practices that official sources preferred to forget or disguise. The silence of the archive speaks as loudly as the screams that once echoed from hidden chambers. Modern forensic analysis of skeletal remains has revealed the true horror of what these people endured. Evidence of prolonged malnutrition, stress indicators in bone development and positioning that suggests final struggles against inevitable death. Each skeleton unearthed serves as a silent testament to a brutal past, a stark reminder that beneath our feet lies stories of unimaginable suffering waiting to be discovered and finally acknowledged. Why would any society build its foundations on living bodies or wall up its own for sins real or imagined? The answer lies deep in the darkest corners of human belief, where superstition, power and cruelty converge to create systems of control that would be impossible to imagine if they weren't documented in stone and bone. The superstitious belief that immuring living people would prevent structural collapse reveals humanity's willingness to sacrifice others for perceived safety. When builders were constructing London Bridge, they genuinely believed that embedding human sacrifices in the foundations would ensure the structure would stand forever. The victims weren't seen as people, they were seen as materials, as necessary components in a supernatural engineering process. This wasn't ignorance born of primitive thinking, these were sophisticated societies with advanced architecture, complex legal systems and detailed religious hierarchies, yet they systematically murdered innocent people based on beliefs that had no basis in reality. The contradiction reveals something fundamental about human nature, our capacity to rationalize any level of cruelty when it serves our perceived interests. The immense power of rulers like Aurangzeb, who aimed his own nieces, demonstrates how absolute authority corrupts completely when a person holds life and death power over others. The temptation to use that power for personal gratification becomes overwhelming. Aurangzeb didn't need to justify his actions to anyone, his word was law, his cruelty unchecked by any external authority. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Jazar Pasha's practice of imming Greeks in walls for his enjoyment reveals how torture can become entertainment for those in power. This wasn't about punishment, justice or even superstition, this was sadism elevated to an institutional level, where human suffering became a form of recreational activity for the ruling class. The psychological framework that enabled these practices relied on dehumanization of victims, whether the target was a sinful nun, a foreign prisoner or a sacrificial offering. Authorities found ways to transform living people into objects that could be disposed of without moral consequence. Once someone was labeled as spiritually contaminated, politically dangerous or supernaturally necessary, their fundamental humanity was erased. Religious institutions proved particularly adept at this psychological manipulation by framing immurement as spiritual purification or divine will. They transformed murder into an act of faith. The authorities convinced themselves and others that they were serving God by slowly torturing people to death. The moral inversion was complete. Cruelty became kindness, murder became mercy, and suffering became salvation. The collective silence that surrounded these practices is perhaps The most damning aspect of all, entire communities knew what was happening. They heard the construction sounds, witnessed the sealed chambers, listened to the gradually weakening cries from within walls, yet they did nothing to intervene. And often actively participated in maintaining the fiction that these were acceptable practices. This silence was enforced through fear as much as conviction. Anyone who questioned the practice might find themselves accused of sympathizing with sinners, challenging divine will, or undermining social order. The threat of becoming the next victim was always present, creating a climate where moral courage became suicidal behavior. The pervasive nature of immurement across cultures and centuries indicates that it satisfied multiple psychological needs for those in power. It provided a method of ultimate control, a way to eliminate troublesome individuals while terrorizing potential dissident, and a ritual outlet for societal fears and frustrations. The slow, hidden nature of the death allowed authorities to maintain plausible deniability while maximizing psychological impact. Some communities developed elaborate theological justifications for their practices. They created complex explanations for why certain sins required this specific punishment, why mercy would be inappropriate, why the suffering served divine purposes. These intellectual frameworks allowed educated, sophisticated people to participate in systematic torture while maintaining their self-image as moral beings. The economic aspects were equally cynical. Immurement allowed authorities to seize the property of victims while avoiding the political complications of open execution. A nun's family might protest her public execution, but they could hardly object to her spiritual retreat. That happened to last forever. The financial incentives reinforced the practice's continuation. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way these practices became normalized through repetition. What initially shocked communities gradually became routine. People stopped noticing the construction of new chambers, stopped hearing the weakening cries, stopped questioning the disappearance of individuals who had somehow offended those in power. The bureaucratization of cruelty transformed individual acts of sadism into systematic processes that could be maintained across generations. New officials would inherit these practices as normal parts of their duties, perpetuating cycles of horror that outlived their original creators. And it was within this terrifying tapestry of power, fear, and brutal justice that our nun accused and condemned faced the unyielding stone of her living grave, surrounded by a society that had convinced itself her torture was righteousness. The final stone slid into place with a sound like thunder in the tiny chamber. Sister Agnes pressed her face against the small opening near the top of her tomb, gasping for air that already tasted stale and lifeless. The light from the corridor beyond grew dim as the masons gathered their tools and walked away, their footsteps echoing until even that human sound faded into terrible silence. Vade in pace, the abbey's voice drifted through the opening one final time. Go in peace. But there would be no peace here, only the slow agony of abandonment. The chamber was barely wider than her shoulders, too low for her to stand upright, too narrow for her to lie down comfortably. This stone coffin would be her world now, perhaps for days, perhaps for weeks, perhaps for months. The authorities had perfected their calculation of minimal sustenance, enough to prevent immediate death, never enough to restore hope. Her crime, they said, was breaking her vow of chastity, but Sister Agnes knew the truth. Her real transgression was refusing the advances of a visiting priest who held influence with the church hierarchy when threats failed to secure her compliance. Accusation became his weapon of choice, one whispered suggestion of impropriety, one claim of broken vows, and the machinery of ecclesiastical justice had ground into motion with inexorable cruelty. The first day brought desperate prayer and futile attempts to find a comfortable position in her stone prison. The second day brought the crushing realization that no divine intervention would come, no human mercy would spare her. By the third day, the tiny cup of water and morsel of bread that appeared at the opening each morning became her entire universe. She scratched marks on the stone walls to count the passing days, her fingernails breaking and bleeding from the effort. 14 days, 21 days, 37 days, each mark a small victory over the erasure that was her intended fate. But eventually the scratching stopped. The weak responses to the guards' daily checks grew fainter and fainter. The breathing that had once echoed in the chamber became whispered gasps, then silence. Sister Agnes had joined the countless forgotten victims of a system that transformed faith into fanaticism, that weaponized sacred vows for political control that convinced entire societies they were serving God by slowly murdering the helpless. Her story was not unique across centuries, and cultures immune claimed thousands of victims whose only crimes were challenging authority, arousing suspicion, or simply being convenient scapegoats for societal fears. The practice persisted because it served multiple masters: religious control, political elimination, economic seizure, and psychological terrorism. The discovery of her remains centuries later would add one more skeleton to the archaeological record, one more piece of evidence for practices that official histories preferred to forget. But her individual suffering, her personal terror, her slow dying in darkness and isolation, these human realities can never be fully captured by academic analysis or historical documentation. The true horror of immune lay not just in its physical cruelty but in its complete denial of human dignity. Victims were transformed from people into problems to be solved, their elimination disguised as spiritual necessity. The psychological framework that enabled such practices reveals humanity's capacity for self-deception when it serves our perceived interests. The practice of immunement stands as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, religious extremism, and social systems that prioritize control over compassion. When institutions convince themselves that cruelty serves divine purposes, when societies silence moral objections through fear and intimidation, when individual humans become expendable for abstract principles, the result is always the same in the end. Sister Agnes' ordeal represents more than historical tragedy. It embodies the eternal struggle between human dignity and systemic oppression, between individual conscience and institutional power, between mercy and the machinery of control that transforms sacred spaces into sites of unimaginable suffering. Okay.